In the 50 years since British comedy group Monty Python premiered on the BBC, the surreal exploits of the troupe have become legendary. Members of any generation can likely quote their favorite scene from Holy Grail on the spot. In turn, each member of Monty Python has gone on to have pretty illustrious and notable careers. John Cleese has appeared in some of the biggest franchises of the last century, Terry Gilliam directed a handful of cult classic films, and Eric Idle created Spamalot. That brings us to Terry Jones, director on all of Python's films. He went on to direct a few films later in his career, but one thing that has always been prevalent is his affinity for medieval history. Over the years, Jones has written a handful of books and documentary series on the topic, and this passion likely led him to developing an idea for a television series. A strange little idea about King Arthur, dragons, and classic Monty Python humor. This is the story of Blazing Dragons. The story of Blazing Dragons begins with the production of another very different show from the early 1990s, The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. Producer George Lucas brought in several talented directors and writers to work on the series, and Terry Jones was one of those hired to direct an episode. The episode, titled Barcelona, May 1917, was written by up-and-coming British writer Gavin Scott. Jones and Scott quickly became friends and would go on to work together several times over the following decades. Sometime in the mid-90s, Jones brought his idea for Blazing Dragons to Scott and, well, not to pull a bait and switch right out of the gate, but that was more or less the end of Terry Jones' involvement in the creation of Blazing Dragons. When asked about Blazing Dragons in 2004, Jones had this to say: "Oh bugger me, oh dear, I've never really watched that. Blazing Dragons was... I came up with the idea during a drunken lunch, I think. I was never able to develop the idea because I was too involved doing something else." From that point forward, the development of Blazing Dragons rested solely on the shoulders of Gavin Scott. Using Terry Jones' basic idea of a parody of Arthurian legend with anthropomorphic dragons and evil humans, Scott created the world and characters in which to set the spoof. Scott brought the series to Canadian animation studio Nelvana, who were receptive of the idea, but hesitant with Scott's vision of how the show should be produced. According to some of the crew who worked on the show, Scott envisioned a darker and more aesthetically realistic show in the vein of the Jim Henson film The Dark Crystal. This was considered too expensive and unrealistic, so a team of writers was hired to write a show that would be much more kid-friendly while still retaining some of that classic Monty Python humor. After a brief meeting between producers at Nelvana and Terry Jones and Gavin Scott, both men were credited as producers and had next to no involvement with the show going forward. The first season of Blazing Dragons aired in 1996 and detailed the adventures of Squire Flicker, Princess Flame, King Allfire, and the Knights of the Square Table. The series ran for 2 seasons and a total of 26 episodes, and I was told that there was an air of uncertainty of how long the show would last from the very start. The budget was so restricted for the second season that artists were forced to change the character models to make them easier to paint and therefore cheaper to animate. However, an error by a producer during the second season led to the crew delivering episodes that were too long for the networks, and they were forced to go back and edit the episodes down to the correct time at the last minute. This tight budget and overall air of uncertainty that lingered over the show were products of the show's overall lack of popularity in both Canada and the US. Blazing Dragons aired mainly on Toon Disney in the US and was heavily censored, removing some of the more adult humor from the show, chiefly scenes of the character Sir Blaze that hinted heavily at his homosexuality.
Blaze, the smartly dressed, ready to serve the hors d'oeuvres.
The show never seemed to catch on with younger audiences and was quietly cancelled after the second season. Releasing alongside the show was a point-and-click adventure game developed by future Tomb Raider devs Crystal Dynamics. The PlayStation 1 version of the game is how I was introduced to the franchise, and it's fair to say that the video game received more attention than the show, although that perhaps isn't saying much. This may be due to the show's voice cast being replaced with more notable actors such as Cheech Marin, Jim Cummings, Harry Shearer, Jess Harnell, and even Terry Jones. The game also features a completely separate story from the show and really seems to be more of a companion piece than a direct tie-in to the show. The fact that Terry Jones contributed more to the game that is almost completely separate from the show that he created really is a solid indicator as to why this whole franchise seemed doomed from the start. I personally really enjoyed the game as a kid, and it's pretty cool to look back now and realize that it was developed by Crystal Dynamics, but in the end, the game did little to help popularize the franchise. I think this is likely in large part due to a bulk of the ads for the game featuring Cheech Marin, who, while always a fixture in pop culture, does little to convince parents this is a game they should buy for their children. And not to mention the fact that I had no idea a show even existed when I played it, because the game and its advertising made no mention of that in any way. So, Blazing Dragons the game came and went with middling reviews and little fanfare, much like the show. Blazing Dragons is one of those interesting cases of something that almost succeeded in spite of everyone's best efforts, and I mean that in the nicest way possible. The crew behind the show really did make something that I think still holds up fairly well, and probably could work for modern audiences of all ages. There's always a gap in the market for Monty Python-inspired entertainment, and I think Blazing Dragons filled it perfectly, but a lack of support from the actual Monty Python member associated with it, limited budgets, censorship here in the US, and just overall confusing marketing all contributed to the franchise's relative obscurity. When I watch the series and play the game, I can't help but wonder who really was the target audience for Blazing Dragons. It seems the producers could never quite decide that either, and here we are 20 years later, and Blazing Dragons is not much more than a random bit of 1990s oddity. But of course, we're still here, aren't we? Blazing Dragons refuses to go away quietly into total obscurity, and for the most part, that's due to the efforts of one young woman from France, Natasha Statari. Natasha had watched the show as a young child and was reintroduced to the series in 2016, and coincidentally met Erica Strobel, a writer and script supervisor on the show. Natasha and Strobel became friends, bonding over their shared love of Blazing Dragons. Strobel mentored the younger Natasha and provided her with original artwork and scripts from her time on the show as inspiration for Natasha's own artistic aspirations. Strobel, who had hoped to write for the show again, also encouraged Natasha to create a blog to rally support to revive Blazing Dragons for a modern audience. Together, they created Blazing Dragons Revolution, a small internet movement with the goal of introducing Blazing Dragons to new audiences, reminding those who may have forgotten about it, and keeping it relevant in the internet age. Since Erica Strobel's tragic passing in 2017, Natasha has managed the little revolution on her own, encouraging others to share artwork, fanfiction, and their passion for Blazing Dragons. She's gained support from several cast members and crew, as well as myself. Over 20 years later, Natasha has kept Blazing Dragons relevant in her own way. Whether or not we ever see a new season of Blazing Dragons, it won't be forgotten. Thanks for watching the newest episode of Newstalgia. I really have to thank Natasha, because without her and her blog, I would have had no idea where to get started on this video. I'd also like to thank the crew members from Blazing Dragons who took time to chat with me about a 20-year-old project. If you'd like to hear more about Blazing Dragons that I couldn't fit in this video, you can listen to our podcast in the description below. I've also included a link to the Blazing Dragons Revolution blog. Again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.